Hi, I'm Mike McHugh, and I'd like to welcome you to the latest episode of TownWorks, an ongoing series in which we are going to bring to you members of boards of appointed boards, members of departments, just to give the residents of Hanson a better understanding, a better insight as to how your town works. I'm happy to say that I have the chairman of the Conservation Commission with me today, Mr. Phil Clemons. Thank you very much for joining me today, Phil.
My pleasure.
And we will actually be having sort of a two-part conversation today. I think we'll start with discussing the ins and outs, the function of the Conservation Commission, and we'll then go into a conversation as to all of the natural resources that the Conservation Commission oversees that the residents of the town of Hanson should be availing themselves of every day if possible. So with that said, Phil, we're aware that you're a 5-member board, and you currently do run with a full 5 members. You do have 1 associate member. And from what I understand, there are further opportunities for other associate members. And maybe you can elaborate on the discussion we had a little while ago in terms of what those associate members could possibly do with the board, with the commission.
Sure. There's a lot to do in and around conservation, and as you say, we have the 5 voting members all in place, but associate members can perform very important roles. They can essentially do anything a regular commissioner could do except vote. No votes can be held. But there are roles such as helping with managing our properties, maybe inspecting the condition of conservation area A, B, or C. If they are so inclined, they could help with leading nature walks, doing things that have to do with public education. And there are lots of small and medium and other tasks that we could use help with, and some of them, frankly, are a little bit fun. You get to be outside and enjoy things and be productive at the same time. And
it would be great if an applicant had some sort of experience, some sort of background in some of the things that you mentioned, but that's not necessarily a requirement. They can learn along the way, and they can learn a lot.
Right. There's a lot of common sense involved, and what we think is most important is just an appreciation of the resources that we have in and around Hanson. We've got a fair amount of open space, we have some nice water resources, and that's a good place to start, just an appreciation for these things.
I think that's great, and I think it's important that the residents know, if they don't already, that your board generally meets every other Tuesday at 7 o'clock. And let's go into a little bit of the regular role of the Conservation Commission. Some of the more, I guess, I don't want to say simple sort of matters, but if a resident wants to make an addition to their house, perhaps put a porch on, put up a pool, a lot of times they need to be cognizant of the fact that they could be close to a wetland or something else that is protected. And they'll need to go before your board and have that discussion and make sure that both sides are comfortable going forward, and you do your best to work with the residents to get things accomplished.
Right. Many times the best place to start if you're contemplating a project is simply to call the conservation office or stop in, and an informal discussion might be all that's needed. Or if something more is needed, if there's a wetland resource nearby, or a pond or a stream or that sort of thing, then we can help them understand what steps are required. And protecting those resources is one of our routine but very important responsibilities, along with things to go above and beyond wetlands, which is not to be overlooked.
And just to give more information out there, I think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, the general rule of thumb is it's about a 50-foot setback from a wetland, and I know there's also a consideration of a 100-foot setback, so maybe you could explain that a little.
Right. The Massachusetts Wetlands Protection Act has been with us for quite a few decades now, and the regulations that implement that give all these definitions. But what it comes down to is there is, sometimes it's clear, sometimes not so clear, there's a boundary between what's considered a wetland resource and what is upland. Well, the value of the space that beyond the actual wetland line is encompassed in what we call a buffer zone. Things that happen there can impact the wetland too. If things run downhill or Wildlife moves around back and forth, and there's a lot of shared values there. So under state law, we protect more than just the wet area itself, more than just the water itself. The 50-foot zone is often called the no-touch zone, but we do have jurisdiction, and we can discuss what is good and not so good to happen within 100 feet of these areas. Again, because the ecosystem doesn't stop right along a dotted line. It functions happen up and down the slope, especially when they're water related.
And as you mentioned, a lot of times those questions can be answered just with a simple call, and I think that both the department and your commission does its best to, again, work with the resident to make it as painless as possible. I've obviously sat through many of your meetings, and I find that the commission moves very quickly, it moves very rationally and very cooperatively. I think that, again, it's a fairly painless process. Some instances it may require a revisit, but I think those are few and far between, and I think, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, I think that generally the average person isn't necessarily in a position where they need to bring in professional help and have an engineer or have an attorney. I think they can work through your board.
That will vary, of course, depending on how ambitious the plan is and how sensitive the area is or is not, where work is contemplated. But the idea of just coming in and talking to us is the right way to start. We have a very friendly staff, and we are always trying to speak to people in a way that makes sense. Sometimes there's learning that needs to happen. Someone might think an area is protected as a wetland and find out, gosh, it isn't. Other times they might be unaware of what constitutes a wetland resource area, and they might be surprised to find out there's things to think about there. But better to find that out sooner rather than after you've already engaged in a project. We want to have people know how and what needs to be done and how to do it. We'll certainly do our best to help them.
Now, we've talked about some of the, I guess, I don't want to say routine, but some of the necessary shorter term things that you look at. However, there are more long-term projects that I know are currently before the commission, two of which that we've discussed a bit not that long ago. And perhaps you can elaborate on those two. I think the first of which is the potential or the hopeful redevelopment and projects going on down on Main Street.
Absolutely. Again, some projects are very small and simple. Some are a little larger and more, shall we say, potentially loaded with impacts, but also loaded with impacts to the good. We are aware as commission members and as residents of Hanson that we need perspective. We protect resources, but we also want to, whenever possible, help people find a way forward to do things. As you mentioned just now, we have some redevelopment that's commencing in South Hanson, the site of the former Ocean Spray facility. The owners there now and the Conservation Commission, we've been in communication for many months, and we believe we have found, a way forward there. We have been shown a master plan for the site and the environmental precautions and protections that would be built into that to control erosion, to improve or reduce the impacts that over the last 100 years have happened there. But these are positive things, and we've been working very much with the owners and their contractors and consultants to both protect the resource, which is a significant one. They border right on the Burridge Pond Wildlife Management Area, and also to just basically enhance the whole neighborhood of South Hanson. We're pleased with where we are. It's still the very early stages, but there is I think a solid plan in place for protecting the environment while some of the economic and other aspects of the neighborhood get improved.
Yeah, that actually, as you mentioned, that's a major project. It's just really coming to fruition, coming to the forefront, and there are an awful lot of players at the table for that. And
Right.
the Conservation Commission is one of the major players there for reasons that you just mentioned. There's an awful lot that needs to be protected in that area, and I think again, both the Conservation Commission and other departments and other boards have been working cooperatively, not in a vacuum, but together to try to move that forward and make that whole stretch of South Hanson something we can all be proud of. The other thing we had been talking about is a development at Depot Village, which is actually right in the same area. It's a 40B. And 40Bs sometimes have, they've got a little more authority in terms of what they wish to do going forward. However, I find that the Conservation Commission does have a significant amount of input as opposed to maybe some of the other departments in that particular setting. And maybe you could elaborate a little bit on your involvement, the Commission's involvement in that development.
Sure. Because it's 40B and they operate under a comprehensive permit, and there's some simplified steps there, the State Wetlands Protection Act still does apply. And the proposed site for Depot Village, it's, of course, north of Main Street, off Phillip Street, behind the MBTA station. It's quite close to some wetland resource areas, too. But that is an area that's been impacted by development and human activity for a long, long time before now. And we're actually still in the midst of an open hearing with them. We are hoping to generate a little more information that would allow us to approve the plans that were at least before the Conservation Commission. I'm not sure how many other hurdles they may have to clear. But we see that as a place where, just like on the other side of Main Street, there can be development and an uplifting of a neighborhood, a advancement, if you will, of smart growth, focusing right near the commuter rail station and places where there are a lot of resources, either existing or potential future retail operations and the like, and be able to protect the environment there, make sure that residents and neighbors don't have any negative impacts, let's say from stormwater and those types of issues, and just help the community become a better community.
Indeed. Now, as we've discussed, the Conservation Commission isn't all just about meetings and signing off on plans and reviews. The Conservation Commission is also the stewards of a great many natural resource opportunities, locations in the town of Hanson. And I know that you're passionate about those things, and I would love to hear you give to the audience, a quick overview of all these different areas, all these different opportunities that, the residents can avail themselves of.
Well, I would just like to point out that we have in existence now, this is at least the third edition of it. Every 7 or 8 years we come out with a new one. We have an open space and recreation plan. This has been conditionally approved by the State Department of Conservation Services, and this, just as the title tells you, talks about the open space resources and recreation, as well as just simple protection of resources that are described in here. And some of the things in this plan, and by the way, one of the best things about this plan is that with approval, it allows us to apply for grants. We have enjoyed recent grants up to as much as $82,000 for protecting land and improving recreation. And we hope there will be more of that coming. But some of the things in this plan are a set of appendices that have maps showing resource areas that we're talking about. Hanson, being part of the planet Earth, is very wet in many places, and we have 2 watersheds. We have the Taunton River watershed. This map of Hanson has a blue line going along right through here that divides the Taunton River watershed on this side from the so-called South Coast watershed, which goes to the North River over here. And the Taunton River watershed is divided into the Poor Meadow Brook subbasin and the Monpont subbasin here. We include these maps in our plans because to manage the resources, we have to figure out what's the big picture that they are part of. And once you see where the wetland and open spaces are, we need to drill down to what the specific parcels are. This other map here shows a great deal of the open space we have. The light green area down the bottom here is the Burridge Pond Wildlife Management Area that the state, the Department of Fish and Game manages. The dark green properties are ones which the Conservation Commission has care and custody of. They include the Smith-Nowazelsky Conservation Area, which is over 100 acres. Actually, it's linked to the Burridge Pond Wildlife Management Area. We have here, this dark green complex is the Poor Meadow Brook Conservation Area. Again, with community preservation funds and a state grant, we were able to protect this a few years ago. That's 115 acres along Poor Meadow Brook, directly upstream from the town's well fields. It enhances not only natural wildlife resources and flood control, but our drinking water. We have, over the other side of town, 103 acres of dark green land here. This is the Alton J. Smith Reserve, or Smitty's Bog, as we call it. This is being managed with United States Department of Agriculture funds. The Natural Resource Conservation Service has provided more than $100,000 for us to take these bogs, which the federal money paid the previous owner to stop farming, because cranberry bogs unfortunately can produce pollutants and things that like phosphorus and nitrogen that go in the ponds. But this area here, which is right next to Camp Kewanee, it's a tremendous open area that we're restoring to a more natural state of affairs. And most of the areas we're speaking of here have numerous walking trails and places where you can go to get away from it all or to get healthy exercise. Down here at Burridge Pond, it's large enough to fish and hunt following state regulations. And there's other areas too. The Veterans Memorial Town Forest right here, which is part of the very nice view behind Town Hall over Wampatuck Pond. That's an interesting project, because right now we actually have an ongoing project where Conservation is working with the Parks and Fields Commission to enhance access. This sign is going to be installed there once the parking lot at the Botieri Field has been emptied of the current contents and improved. It'll be a point of public access to the town forest and to the trail system there. And this is meant to tell people, whether you're local or from out of town, if you're looking for a place to safely park and enjoy the outdoors, you're in the right place. Here's your spot. So that's going to hopefully go up in the near future. We're also working with the towns of Pembroke and Hanover. Up in the northeast corner here, we have a small conservation area called the Rocky Run Conservation Area. It's the headwaters of what eventually becomes the North River. And collectively, the three towns just received a $41,000 state grant to enhance a trail loop that will go along both sides of the river. So over the next 2 years, that's another place. There will be signage, there will be hopefully a couple of picnic tables, some parking spaces. We want people to know where to go to enjoy these resources, and that's just a portion of what Hanson has to offer.
Now, Phil, excuse me, you touch upon something interesting that obviously expands outside of Hanson, but I've always been fascinated when you've told me bits and pieces about it. Maybe you can explain a little bit about the overall Bay State Trail and how it's developed and Hanson's role and potential role. I know there's the possibility of extension of that trail throughout our town, but if you could give the audience a little idea of not only how that affects Hanson or how that's available within the town of Hanson, but also elsewhere.
It's always fun to be part of, to not only have local resources, but to know you're part of something bigger. The Bay Circuit Trail is actually a concept that's existed since 1929. The same individuals that made the Appalachian Trail happen also recognized that in the early 20th century we needed an outer emerald necklace around Boston for the population at that time, which was lower but showing signs of growth, to just enjoy being outdoors. And the Bay Circuit Trail is a 200-mile outer emerald necklace that goes all the way from Plum Island in the north down to Kingston Bay and Duxbury Bay, closer to our place. Hanson has about 7 miles of that trail. It goes right through town. It actually goes through the Burridge Pond Wildlife Management Area in Smith-Nalazelski, up through the center of town. We hope to enhance the Plymouth County Hospital property open space enjoyment with the trail going onto the property. Comes around past Town Hall, goes through Veterans Memorial Town Forest, then down to Camp Kewanee and Smitty's Bog, and over into Pembroke. There's a terrific website which people can enjoy. It's www.baycircuit.org. So just the words, baycircuit.org, will get you to a lot of information about that. But that trail can only happen if towns like Hanson do their part to put up and maintain signage and to make sure it goes to the places we want people to enjoy.
Now you touch upon something interesting as well. I'm going to ask you to sort of change your hat here for 1 second. You touch upon the redevelopment or the development of the old Plymouth County Hospital. And you and I and members of the Reuse Commission have been working on that long before I've gotten here. However, within the last year or so, as regrettable as it was, we did take the building down. It really had outlived its possibilities. And there are ongoing discussions, as towards the future of that particular property. And I know that we've had there have been other shows on the cable station in regards to that. We've brought to the cable station a couple of different shows that had been done, or presentations that had actually been done at the Conway School that you and I had actually participated in, or we had visited. There is right now a very real potential, a real momentum towards putting a park there, among some other things that are being discussed. But the primary, at this point, given the public input, goal is to put a rather significant public park there. And maybe you could talk a little bit, again, you're changing hats, but
Sure.
You're captive to me right now, so if you maybe you could talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Well, Hanson's got a lot of resources, including some that other communities could only wish they had. And having 50 or so acres right in the middle of town that's largely undeveloped or only somewhat developed around the edges is a terrific resource. And what the committee that the selectmen formed about 2.5 years ago, the committee is doing, the final Plymouth County Hospital Reuse Committee. We are building on the work that previous committees have done. Those of us who have lived in the area all our lives so far know what the history of the property is, but we also are trying to see what the future can and should be. And we've looked at proposals that have been made in the past, both with and without the buildings, and it was with regret that we concluded, and the town agreed, that the building had outlived its usefulness and did have to come down. But we now have quite a few acres of open space that's located in the center of town, within walking distance of the train station, easily accessible to folks. And a lot of advice we've received, both from residents in town and consultants outside, you know what? That property, if it were developed, part of it, into a park, which is something Hanson has never had. I mean, we have forests, we have fields, we have sports fields, we have Camp Kewanee, we have a nice beach at Cranberry Cove, we have a lawn beside the town hall. We've never had an actual park, a municipal park. That would enhance the quality of life everywhere. The residents and even some of the commercial interests in town would be that much better off by having that element in the community that we have been lacking.
It's very exciting and offers an awful lot of opportunity, and I think is really going to be, as you mentioned, a gem to the town of Hanson, right in the heart of the town of Hanson.
There were trees that needed to come down at Kewanee, and at the same time, we've been working with the Natural Resource Conservation Service, the feds, so to speak, to enhance wildlife habitat over at Smitty's Bog. It's a proven concept that when you have an area that is a wetland and used to have, and in the future will have trees on it as well as flat open areas, the debris, if you will, from either a standing or a fallen tree is extremely important to wildlife. turtles and birds and other things need shelter underneath or be able to crawl out and sun themselves on the upper portions. Instead of having just a flat area with a few ditches with water, places such as Eel River and Tidmarsh Farms and other restoration projects in Massachusetts, in Plymouth, there's some big ones there, have proven that if you bring up front, if you bring some what they call large woody debris into the environment, you'll help everything. So we have staged a modest supply of what looks like waste material, stumps and logs, but actually a very valuable wildlife enhancement features. We're going to take something that could be a problem, but actually turn it into an asset. Made it very simple because they only had to travel a short distance, save disposal costs, and federal money will pay for placing them there. So we see ourselves cooperating with Highway, with Tree, for that matter, the Recreation Commission at Kewanee right next door, the Water Department and other places. But the Smitty's Bog question, what we'll see over the next couple of years, some real changes there. Still keep walking trails and public access to the pond, but hopefully reduce past damage and make it better both for wildlife and people.
And we're just about at conclusion, but as I mentioned, I wanted to bring up one last thing that I think is very significant cooperation between departments, and also I think is of great significance for the quality of life in Hanson. And that's the fact that on a piece of conservation land, the Water Department is currently exploring the possibility of one, if not two, new wells to ensure clean drinking water in the future for the residents of the town of Hanson. If maybe we could conclude, you could wrap up with a quick description of what's going on there.
Right, that's a very forward-looking topic, and we're delighted to be part of it. Again, one of the things that our surveys have shown, and common sense tells us, is that one of the main reasons for protecting open space is to protect the water resources that exist on or under it. And we all are fans of water. I have drinking water here somewhere. But, okay. The Water Department has, to its credit, in the last few decades, developed wells in town, so we're not completely dependent on Brockton. And unfortunately, we're close to capacity there. And in the northeast part of town, if I could point to the map here, this area here, the Webster Billings Conservation Area, shows signs of having significant underground water resources. We are working through all the necessary proper legal procedures with the Water Department. We've allowed them to develop a road into where a well or two wells could be drilled. That drilling will happen very soon. We presume that there's an excellent chance that the quality and the quantity of water there will be such that it will take a great deal of pressure off the other wells in town and balance, if you will, some of the water coming from each of the two main watersheds in Hanson that we spoke about, and basically make Hanson more water secure. What we also envision is the land still being maintained as conservation land. The public would not be excluded. The public would be allowed to walk there, use the trails, and we see signs of good things to come there.
And that's great. And Phil, with that, I want to thank you very, very much for sitting with me and having the conversation, which I hope is very enlightening to the residents of Hanson. I hope to very soon meet with you again through this medium, bring before you another member of a board or commission or one of our department heads, to give you more of an insight as to how your town works. It's your town. We want to hear from you. We'd love your participation. As Phil just mentioned, there are opportunities as associate members on the Conservation Commission, as well as many other opportunities to participate in your town. So with that, I bid you goodbye, and I look forward to seeing you the next time.